My fiancé asked me to plan the proposal and criticized everything I did after. I was sitting in our living room staring at a spreadsheet Rebecca had created titled Proposal Deficiency Analysis when my hands started shaking. The document had 43 line items, each one detailing a specific failure in how I'd proposed to her 3 weeks earlier. Row 17 said, ring presentation angle suboptimal, diminished emotional impact by approximately 34%. Row 29 read, failure to secure professional photographer despite advance notice, resulting in lost content opportunities. At the bottom, she'd calculated an overall proposal performance score of 58 out of 100, with detailed recommendations for how I should have achieved her minimum acceptable threshold of 85. My fiancé had literally graded the proposal she'd asked me to plan, and I'd failed. I'd been dating Rebecca for 18 months when she first mentioned marriage, bringing it up casually over dinner at her favorite Italian restaurant downtown. She worked as a marketing director for a lifestyle brand, always impeccably dressed and organized, with an Instagram following of 38,000 people who consumed her carefully curated content about wellness, relationships, and personal growth. I was a project manager at a construction firm, making solid money but living a much quieter life than Rebecca's social media presence suggested we should. She'd started hinting about proposals around month 15, showing me engagement rings on her phone, and talking about how important it was that proposals be meaningful and well executed, that they set the tone for the entire marriage. When Rebecca finally sat me down 6 weeks before the actual proposal and told me she wanted to discuss our engagement timeline, I'd been relieved that we were finally having the conversation directly. She pulled out her tablet and showed me a document she'd created called Our Engagement Vision, complete with mood boards, venue suggestions, and a detailed breakdown of proposal elements she considered essential. She explained that she'd seen too many friends disappointed by proposals that didn't meet their expectations, and she wanted us to collaborate on planning ours so it would be perfect. She said the actual moment would still be a surprise, because I'd be choosing the exact date and time, but she wanted input on the general parameters to ensure it aligned with her vision for our story. I should have seen the red flags then, the way she talked about our proposal, while simultaneously making it clear that my role was to execute her specifications. But I told myself she was just being practical, that she knew what she wanted and was communicating it clearly, which seemed healthier than expecting me to read her mind. She'd created categories for different proposal elements like location, ring specifications, photography requirements, guest list for the immediate aftermath celebration, and social media strategy. Under each category, she'd listed her preferences and requirements, things like natural lighting for optimal photos, minimum 1.5 carat diamond, clarity VS1 or better, and proposal must be shareable on Instagram within 2 hours of occurring. I spent the next 4 weeks planning according to her specifications, trying to find the perfect balance between her requirements and creating something that still felt personal and romantic. I chose a botanical garden she'd mentioned loving, booked it for a Saturday evening in early October, when the fall colors would be peak and the lighting would be ideal. I found a photographer who specialized in proposals and could hide in the background to capture candid moments. I bought a ring that met her specifications, a 1.7 carat diamond in a platinum setting from the jeweler she'd favorited on Instagram. I planned a small celebration afterward at a restaurant she'd mentioned wanting to try, inviting her parents and closest friends to join us immediately after she said yes. The proposal itself had felt magical to me, at least in the moment. The garden was beautiful, with golden autumn light filtering through trees, just starting to turn orange and red. I'd walked with Rebecca along the path she'd specified, holding her hand and talking about our future together, and when we reached the small bridge over the pond, I'd gotten down on one knee. I told her I loved her and wanted to spend my life with her, and I asked her to marry me. She'd said yes with tears in her eyes, and I'd slipped the ring onto her finger while the hidden photographer captured everything. Her parents and friends had appeared on cue, and we'd celebrated with champagne and appetizers at the restaurant, with Rebecca showing off her ring and recounting the proposal to everyone. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. But the criticism started before we'd even left the celebration dinner. Rebecca pulled me aside and whispered that she'd noticed the photographer had been positioned too far away during the actual proposal, that the angles might not be ideal for the content she wanted to create. She said it with a smile, but her eyes were serious, and I assured her the photographer was a professional who'd gotten great shots. She nodded, but I could see her mentally cataloging this concern for later discussion. During the drive home, she mentioned that the bridge location had been lovely, but slightly more shaded than she'd hoped, that the lighting in her mental vision had been a bit brighter and more golden. I told her the lighting had been beautiful, but she said I didn't understand photography the way she did from her work in visual content. The real breakdown came 2 days later when the photographer sent us the proof gallery of 185 images from the proposal. Rebecca spent 3 hours going through them on her laptop, and I watched her expression grow increasingly tight and frustrated. She finally turned the screen toward me and started clicking through images, pointing out everything wrong with them. The angle of this shot made her chin look undefined. That photo caught her mid-blink. This one showed the ring box at an awkward angle. That candid moment captured an unflattering expression. She said out of 185 photos, maybe 20 were usable for her content strategy, and that ratio was completely unacceptable for such an important milestone event. I suggested that maybe we were being too critical, that the photos looked beautiful and captured a genuine moment of joy and love. Rebecca looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, this cold assessment that made me feel like I'd revealed a fundamental failure to understand something obvious. She told me that I clearly didn't grasp how important documentation was for major life events, that our engagement would be part of our story forever, and that settling for mediocre content because I didn't want to acknowledge planning failures was exactly the kind of attitude that led to regret later. She said she'd been clear about her expectations, and I'd failed to meet them, and now we had to deal with suboptimal content for one of the most important moments of our lives. Over the next week, Rebecca created the spreadsheet I now held in my shaking hands, the 43-item proposal deficiency analysis that graded every aspect of the proposal I'd spent a month planning according to her specifications. She'd assigned numerical scores to categories like aesthetic execution, emotional authenticity, technical quality, social media optimization, and romantic gesture innovation. Under each category were subcategories with specific deficiencies noted. She'd written that my verbal proposal speech lacked the poetic quality she'd expected, that I should have prepared written remarks and practiced delivery for better emotional impact. She noted that the ring, while meeting minimum specifications, could have been upgraded to 2 carats to better reflect the significance of the commitment. The spreadsheet included a section on financial investment that made my stomach turn. Rebecca had calculated that I'd spent approximately $8,000 on the entire proposal, including ring, photographer, venue rental, and celebration dinner. She'd noted that based on traditional guidelines of spending 2 to 3 months' salary on an engagement ring, my total investment should have been closer to $18,000. She'd created a deficit calculation showing I'd underinvested by $10,000, and suggested ways this could be remedied through upgraded wedding planning choices or a ring upgrade before the ceremony. She'd literally created a financial gap analysis for our engagement. I called my best friend Gavin that night, after Rebecca had gone to bed early, with what she called a stress headache from reviewing the proposal documentation. Gavin worked as an accountant and had always been level-headed about relationship issues, and I needed someone to tell me if I was crazy for being disturbed by this spreadsheet. I read him some of the line items over the phone, and there was silence on his end for so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, he told me to get out of the relationship immediately, that this level of control and criticism was abusive, and that it would only get worse as wedding planning progressed. He said normal people didn't grade their proposals like performance reviews, but I didn't leave because I kept telling myself Rebecca just had high standards and clear communication, that she was expressing disappointment in a direct way rather than letting it fester. I scheduled a time to discuss the spreadsheet with her, approaching it like a work meeting because that seemed to be the language she understood. Rebecca pulled up the document on her laptop at our kitchen table and went through each line item with me, explaining her reasoning and showing me examples of other proposals she'd seen online that demonstrated the standards I should have met. She showed me Instagram posts from influencers with elaborate proposal setups, professional videography, perfect ring choices, and flawless execution. She said these were the benchmarks our generation used for major life events. I tried explaining that those were often staged or heavily sponsored content, that comparing real life to influencer marketing wasn't healthy or realistic. Rebecca's expression went cold again, and she told me I was being dismissive of her feelings and invalidating her disappointment. She said she'd been extremely clear about her expectations, that I'd had every opportunity to ask questions or request clarification, and that my failure to meet her clearly communicated standards reflected either lack of effort or lack of care about her happiness. She asked which one it was, and I felt trapped by the question, because both options painted me as a bad partner. I apologized for disappointing her, and asked what I could do to make it better. Rebecca's demeanor shifted immediately when I apologized, becoming warm and understanding again. She reached across the table and took my hand, telling me she appreciated my willingness to acknowledge the issues and work on improvement. She said relationships required both partners to meet each other's needs, and that she had high standards because she valued our relationship and wanted us to have the best possible foundation. She suggested we create a collaborative planning document for the wedding that would include detailed specifications and checkpoints to ensure nothing fell short of expectations this time. She said the proposal had been a learning experience, and now we could apply those lessons to create the perfect wedding. The wedding planning began immediately, with Rebecca creating a master spreadsheet that made the proposal analysis look simple by comparison. She'd researched average wedding costs and determined that based on our combined incomes and her parents' promised contribution of $15,000, our total wedding budget should be $75,000. She'd broken this down by category with specific allocation amounts for venue, catering, photography, flowers, dress, suit, music, and about 20 other line items. She'd created a task list with over 300 items, each assigned to either me, her parents, or various vendors, with due dates and priority rankings. She scheduled weekly planning meetings on Sunday afternoons, where we'd review progress against the timeline. The first planning meeting lasted 4 hours, with Rebecca going through venue options she'd researched and explaining the pros and cons of each. She'd created a scoring matrix that rated venues on factors like aesthetic quality, capacity, location convenience, photography potential, and cost efficiency. Her top choice was a historic estate that cost $35,000 just for the venue rental, taking up nearly half our entire budget. I suggested we look at some more affordable options that would give us more budget flexibility for other elements, and Rebecca marked this down in a planning discussions log she kept, noting my resistance to investing appropriately in venue selection. Every disagreement or suggestion I made was documented as a discussion point, with her interpretation of what it revealed about my priorities. I started noticing that Rebecca was recording our planning conversations on her phone, leaving it face up on the table with the voice memo app running during our Sunday meetings. When I asked her about it, she said she was just keeping records so we wouldn't forget any decisions or discussions, that it was a project management best practice. Something about it felt off, like she was building a case file rather than planning a celebration, but I told myself I was being paranoid. She showed me her organization system where she'd created folders for different wedding elements, each containing notes, photos, recordings, and her analysis of my engagement level and decision quality. She called it being thorough. The criticism that had started with the proposal began bleeding into other areas of our relationship. Rebecca created a household responsibilities matrix that assigned point values to different chores and tasks, calculating that I was contributing 42% to her 58%, despite us both working full-time. She'd started tracking my communication patterns, noting how quickly I responded to her texts and rating the emotional quality of my responses on a scale of 1 to 10. She logged my participation in her social media content, documenting when I appeared in photos or videos and how my presence contributed to or detracted from her engagement metrics. Every aspect of my existence as her partner was being quantified and judged against standards I'd never agreed to. I suggested we see a couples therapist to work through some of these issues, and Rebecca immediately agreed, but insisted on choosing the therapist herself to ensure they understood modern relationship dynamics. She selected Dr. Nina Campbell, who had a practice specializing in high-achieving couples and had written articles about conscious partnership and intentional relationship design. The consultation fee was $300 per session, not covered by insurance, but Rebecca said investing in professional support was essential for our success as a couple. Our first session was scheduled for a Thursday evening 3 weeks before our planned engagement party. Dr. Campbell's office was in an upscale building downtown with modern furniture and abstract art on the walls. She was a woman in her early 50s with careful makeup and an air of professional warmth that felt practiced. She had us sit on opposite ends of a leather couch and started by asking each of us to share what brought us to therapy. I tried to explain that I felt like Rebecca had very high expectations that I was constantly failing to meet, that I was being graded and tracked in ways that made me feel inadequate rather than loved. Rebecca waited until I finished and then calmly presented the proposal spreadsheet and wedding planning documents to Dr. Campbell, explaining that she simply had clear standards and was trying to communicate them to a partner who seemed resistant to growth. Dr. Campbell reviewed the documents with a neutral expression, asking Rebecca questions about why she'd chosen to quantify these relationship elements and what she hoped to achieve through the tracking systems. Rebecca explained that she'd read extensively about emotional labor and relationship equity, that she'd learned from her work in marketing about the importance of measurable outcomes, and that she was simply applying professional best practices to ensure her personal life was as successful as her career. She said too many women settled for partners who didn't meet their needs, and she was being proactive about ensuring I understood and met hers. She presented it all so reasonably that I started doubting my own concerns. But then Dr. Campbell turned to me and asked how being tracked and graded made me feel as a human being in this relationship. The question hit something deep, and I felt tears form in my eyes as I tried to articulate the constant anxiety of knowing everything I did was being documented and assessed, a feeling like I could never just be present in a moment without wondering how it would be scored later. I told her about the proposal spreadsheet and how devastating it had been to have something I'd planned so carefully be broken down into 43 failures. Dr. Campbell nodded and made notes, and when I finished, she set down her pen and looked at Rebecca with a directness that surprised me. The therapist said she'd worked with many couples who struggled with expectations and communication, but that she'd rarely seen someone systematically grade their partner's performance across all relationship domains the way Rebecca was doing. She said that while having standards was healthy, weaponizing data and creating constant performance anxiety was a form of emotional abuse. She told Rebecca that love couldn't be optimized like a marketing campaign, that human beings weren't projects to be managed, and that the level of control and criticism she was displaying suggested some deeper issues that would benefit from individual therapy. Rebecca's face went white and then red, and she stood up and said this was exactly the kind of invalidation she'd expected from traditional therapy models that didn't understand modern relationships. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. Rebecca walked out of Dr. Campbell's office, and I followed her to the parking lot, where she was already in her car with the engine running. I knocked on the window and she rolled it down, her face composed but her eyes furious. She told me that Dr. Campbell was clearly not the right fit for us, that she'd been unprofessional and biased, and that we'd need to find a different therapist who actually understood relationship dynamics. I asked if we could talk about what Dr. Campbell had said, if maybe there was some truth to the concern that the tracking and grading was harmful. Rebecca told me I was welcome to find my own therapist if I needed someone to validate my unwillingness to meet reasonable standards, but that she was done trying to get me to see reason for tonight. I didn't go home that night. I drove to Gavin's apartment and told him everything that had happened in the therapy session, showing him the spreadsheets and documents Rebecca had created. Gavin had been skeptical of Rebecca from early in our relationship, sensing something performative about her that I'd dismissed as him not understanding her professional persona. Now he looked at the proposal deficiency analysis and the household responsibilities matrix with an expression of genuine alarm. He told me this was beyond normal relationship issues, that Rebecca was demonstrating clear signs of narcissistic personality disorder or something similar, and that I needed to get out before we were legally bound through marriage. But leaving felt impossible because I'd already committed, already said yes to spending my life with her, already involved both our families, and started planning a wedding. The engagement party was in 3 weeks with 80 guests confirmed, most of them Rebecca's friends and professional contacts who'd seen her announcement posts about our engagement. She'd created a hashtag for our relationship and had been building content around our wedding planning journey, posting aesthetic photos and thoughtful captions about conscious partnership. Her followers engaged heavily with the content, and she'd mentioned several times that brands were reaching out about potential wedding sponsorships if we were willing to feature their products in our ceremony and reception. I went back home the next morning to find Rebecca sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, and she greeted me calmly, like nothing had happened. She said she'd spent the evening researching therapists and had found someone who specialized in integrative relationship coaching using data-driven approaches to partnership optimization. The new therapist's website featured testimonials about how their methods had saved marriages and improved relationship satisfaction scores, with before and after metrics showing measurable improvement. Rebecca said she'd booked us a consultation for the following Monday, and that this therapist would understand what we were trying to achieve. I agreed, because saying no felt like admitting defeat. The new therapist was a man named Victor Hollis, who operated out of a home office and described himself as a relationship performance coach rather than a traditional therapist. He wasn't licensed as far as I could tell, but he'd written an ebook about quantified relationships and had a YouTube channel with 12,000 subscribers where he discussed optimization strategies for modern couples. The session cost $400, and Rebecca paid it happily, saying real expertise was worth investing in. Victor listened to Rebecca's explanation of her systems and nodded enthusiastically, saying she was ahead of the curve in understanding that successful relationships required measurement and accountability. Victor spent 90 minutes validating every tracking system Rebecca had created, suggesting additional metrics she could monitor, and offering to sell us his proprietary relationship excellence platform for a monthly subscription of $200. The platform included templates for performance tracking, automated scoring algorithms, and benchmark data from other couples to compare ourselves against. Rebecca was thrilled and subscribed immediately, entering our relationship data into the system while Victor walked us through the interface. I sat there feeling like I was drowning while they discussed optimal frequency rates for date nights and acceptable response time ranges for text messages. When the session ended, Rebecca was energized, and I was hollow. The engagement party was held at an upscale event space Rebecca had selected, with professional photography and videography teams capturing everything for her social media content. I'd been given a detailed briefing document about the event timeline, my role in various photo opportunities, and talking points for when guests asked about our wedding plans. Rebecca had coordinated outfits for both of us, spending $800 on my suit and having it tailored to photograph well. The party cost $12,000, which came entirely from my savings, because Rebecca said engagement parties were traditionally the groom's financial responsibility. I'd never heard that tradition before, but didn't argue. The party itself was beautiful, but felt completely hollow to me. I smiled for photos and made conversation with Rebecca's friends and business contacts, most of whom I'd never met before. Her parents were there being charming and congratulating us, and my parents attended looking slightly overwhelmed by the scale of the event. My mom pulled me aside at one point and asked if I was happy, really happy, and I told her I was just stressed about wedding planning. She looked at me with concern and said that planning a wedding should be exciting, not stressful, and that if I was having doubts, it was better to address them before the wedding than after. I assured her everything was fine, but her question planted a seed of doubt I couldn't ignore. Rebecca posted 38 photos and 12 videos from the engagement party over the following week, each with carefully crafted captions about love and partnership and growth. Her engagement metrics were high, with hundreds of comments congratulating us and asking about wedding details. She'd created an Instagram highlight reel for our relationship called Our Journey that presented a curated version of our story, all aesthetic moments and romantic captions with no hint of the spreadsheets and performance reviews happening behind the scenes. I barely recognized our relationship in her content, and I realized her followers were in love with a complete fiction. The wedding planning intensified after the engagement party, with Rebecca creating daily task lists and sending me calendar invites for planning sessions and vendor meetings. She'd hired a wedding planner named Stephanie Cross, who had 20 years of experience and a reputation for executing flawless high-end weddings. Stephanie charged $15,000 for full-service planning, which Rebecca added to our budget by reducing other categories. At our first meeting with Stephanie, Rebecca presented her master planning spreadsheet and explained her vision for the wedding. Stephanie listened politely and then gently suggested that some of Rebecca's expectations might need adjusting based on our stated budget of $75,000. Rebecca's face did that cold expression again, and she told Stephanie that budget constraints were a planning challenge to be solved, not a limitation to accept. She said creative problem solving was literally what we were paying $15,000 for, and that she expected Stephanie to find ways to achieve her vision within budget rather than limiting the vision to match the budget. Stephanie maintained her professional composure and said she'd work on some options, but I saw her make a note on her tablet that I suspected was documenting this interaction as a red flag. After the meeting, Rebecca was frustrated, saying that Stephanie seemed too focused on limitations rather than possibilities, and that we might need to find a different planner who understood our vision better. I finally broke down 3 days later during a particularly intense Sunday planning session where Rebecca spent 90 minutes criticizing my lack of engagement with the flower selection process. She'd created a presentation with 63 different floral arrangement options and expected me to have opinions on each one, but they all looked beautiful to me, and I couldn't muster the energy to pretend I cared about the difference between garden roses and peonies. Rebecca's frustration built as I gave non-committal responses, and she finally closed her laptop and told me that my lack of investment in our wedding planning was really a lack of investment in our future together. She said if I couldn't care enough to engage with something as important as our wedding day, how could she trust me to show up for actual marriage challenges? I told her I couldn't do this anymore, that I felt like I was being managed rather than loved, that every interaction had become a performance review, and I was exhausted from constantly failing to meet standards I'd never agreed to. I said the proposal spreadsheet had been devastating, that being graded on how I'd proposed had made something that should have been joyful into something shameful. I told her about the tracking and monitoring making me feel anxious and inadequate, and that I didn't think we should get married if this was how our relationship functioned. Rebecca looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, and then she told me we should take a break from wedding planning for a week to get some perspective. She said we were both stressed and saying things we didn't mean, but instead of taking a break, Rebecca escalated everything. She sent me an email the next day with the subject line, Partnership Dissolution Analysis, that made my heart stop. I opened it to find a 17-page document outlining what would happen if we ended the engagement, including financial implications of canceling vendors, social implications of public announcement, and personal implications for both our futures. She'd calculated that ending things now would cost approximately $48,000 in lost deposits and cancellation fees, most of which would fall on me since I'd paid for the majority of wedding expenses so far. She'd noted the social embarrassment for both families and the professional impact on her personal brand given her public engagement content. She'd created decision trees showing different scenarios and their outcomes. The document also included a section titled Path Forward Options that presented 3 choices. Option 1 was to continue with the wedding as planned and commit to the relationship with renewed intention and effort from both parties. Option 2 was to postpone the wedding and do intensive couples coaching with Victor Hollis at $200 per session twice weekly for 6 months. Option 3 was to end the engagement and accept all associated financial and social consequences. Each option had a detailed breakdown of requirements and expected outcomes. At the bottom, she'd noted that she needed my decision within 72 hours to minimize additional financial exposure. I called my sister Claire, who worked as a family law attorney in another state, forwarding her all of Rebecca's documents and explaining the entire situation. Claire read everything and called me back within 2 hours, her voice tight with controlled anger. She said Rebecca's behavior constituted financial coercion and emotional abuse, that the spreadsheets and tracking systems demonstrated a pattern of control that would likely continue and escalate after marriage. She said the partnership dissolution analysis was essentially a blackmail document designed to trap me in the relationship by making leaving seem impossible. She told me to contact a local attorney immediately to understand my actual legal and financial exposure, and to not make any decisions under the artificial deadline Rebecca had imposed. I met with an attorney named David Langford, who specialized in family law and had 31 years of experience. I showed him all of Rebecca's documents and explained the situation, and he reviewed everything with the careful attention of someone who'd seen many complicated cases. When he finished, he told me that most of the financial claims in Rebecca's dissolution analysis were exaggerated or outright false. He explained that engagement wasn't a legally binding contract, that I wasn't obligated to pay for a wedding that didn't happen, and that vendor deposits I'd paid could likely be recovered or minimized through proper communication. He said Rebecca was using manufactured financial fear to control my decision-making, which was a manipulation tactic he'd seen before in controlling relationships. Attorney Langford helped me draft a detailed response to Rebecca's dissolution analysis, correcting the financial misrepresentations and clearly stating my decision to end the engagement. He advised me to change locks if Rebecca had keys to my apartment, to document all interactions going forward, and to be prepared for her to escalate publicly given her social media presence. He said people who maintained this level of control didn't typically accept rejection gracefully, and that I should protect myself financially and legally. The letter was sent to Rebecca via certified mail and email, formally ending our engagement and requesting that she cease all contact except through attorneys regarding any actual shared financial obligations. Rebecca's response came within 6 hours via a social media post that appeared on all her platforms simultaneously. It was a tearful video of her talking about how she'd just been blindsided by her fiancé, ending their engagement via lawyer letter, how she'd invested 2 years of her life and enormous emotional energy into the relationship, and how this betrayal had devastated her. She showed the engagement ring, talked about the wedding they'd been planning, and cried as she described feeling used and discarded. The video went viral within her networks, getting thousands of sympathetic comments and shares. Her followers were outraged on her behalf, with many commenting that I was clearly a coward and a user who'd wasted her time. The social media assault continued for days, with Rebecca posting daily updates about her heartbreak and healing journey. She shared screenshots of our text conversations carefully edited to remove context and make me look cold and dismissive. She posted photos from our relationship with captions about how she'd missed red flags and ignored her intuition. She created content about emotional abuse and narcissistic behavior patterns, implying without directly stating that I'd exhibited these traits. Her followers ate it up, turning me into a villain in a story where I'd actually been the victim. I started getting messages from people I didn't know calling me terrible things and telling me I didn't deserve someone like Rebecca. I wanted to defend myself, but Attorney Langford strongly advised against engaging publicly, saying anything I posted would be twisted and used against me. Instead, he suggested documenting everything Rebecca posted in case we needed evidence of harassment or defamation. I felt completely powerless, as my reputation was destroyed online by someone I'd nearly married, and I realized this was exactly the kind of control she'd been exerting throughout our relationship, just now turned outward against me. Gavin helped me by systematically reporting Rebecca's posts for harassment and encouraging mutual friends to do the same, but the damage was spreading faster than we could contain it. Then something unexpected happened. One of Rebecca's ex-boyfriends, a man named Austin Finley who I'd never met, reached out to me through mutual connections. He said he'd been following the situation on social media and felt compelled to share his own experience dating Rebecca. He'd been engaged to her 4 years earlier, and the relationship had followed an almost identical pattern to mine. She'd asked him to plan his proposal according to her specifications, then created a detailed analysis of everything he'd done wrong. She'd tracked and graded his performance throughout their relationship, created elaborate documentation systems, and ultimately posted a viral breakup narrative when he'd tried to end things. Austin had screenshots and records of everything from his own relationship with Rebecca. Austin introduced me to another ex-boyfriend, someone named Richard Kramer, who dated Rebecca between Austin's engagement and mine. Richard told a similar story with the same patterns of control, tracking, and eventual public destruction when he'd tried to leave. He'd kept all of Rebecca's spreadsheets and documents from their relationship because his therapist had told him he might need them someday to remember that his perceptions of the abuse were real. Between the three of us, we had documentation of Rebecca running the same systematic manipulation campaign on at least 3 separate partners over a span of 6 years. Each relationship had lasted between 18 months and 2 years. Each had included an engagement with criticism of the proposal, and each had ended with her publicly destroying the man's reputation when he tried to leave. Attorney Langford advised us to compile all the documentation and present it to a journalist who specialized in exposing fraud and manipulation. We connected with a writer named Diana Price, who worked for a major online publication and had a reputation for careful, thorough investigative reporting. Diana spent 3 weeks verifying our stories, interviewing all 3 of us separately, reviewing the documentation we'd provided, and even speaking with Dr. Nina Campbell, who confirmed the patterns of abuse. Diana found Rebecca's crowdfunding campaign from her previous breakup with Richard, where she'd raised $18,000 claiming emotional trauma and financial hardship, despite having a 6-figure salary and no actual financial need. This was a pattern of behavior designed to extract both emotional and financial resources from partners. Diana's article published on a Friday morning with the headline, "The Serial Engager, How One Woman Weaponized Relationship Tracking to Control and Exploit Multiple Partners." The piece was meticulously reported with all the documentation, expert commentary from Dr. Campbell and other relationship therapists, and interviews with all 3 ex-boyfriends describing identical patterns of behavior. It detailed Rebecca's methods, showed examples of her spreadsheets and grading systems, and exposed the manufactured narratives she'd created when each relationship ended. The article included screenshots of her social media posts side by side with the actual evidence of what had happened, making it impossible to deny the manipulation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Rebecca's social media accounts were flooded with comments from people who'd believed her previous narratives and now felt deceived. Several of her brand partnerships issued statements distancing themselves from her and terminating sponsorship agreements. Her employer, the lifestyle brand she worked for as marketing director, put her on administrative leave pending an internal review of whether her public behavior violated company values. The hashtag from our engagement that she'd used so prominently became associated with the scandal rather than her curated love story. Her follower count dropped by over 15,000 in the first 48 hours after publication. Rebecca tried to respond with a video claiming the article was false and that we'd collaborated to destroy her out of revenge, but nobody believed her anymore. Too many people had been part of the pattern, too much documentation existed, and the evidence was too overwhelming. She hired a crisis management publicist who advised her to shut down her social media accounts and issue no further public statements, which she finally did 5 days after the article published. Her Instagram account went dark after a final post claiming she was focusing on healing and privacy, and her professional website was taken offline entirely. The woman who'd built her entire identity around curated content and public performance had been forced into silence by the truth. I started therapy with Dr. Campbell individually to process everything that had happened, and she helped me understand that I'd been in an abusive relationship even though Rebecca had never physically harmed me. She explained that systematic control, constant criticism, and financial coercion were all forms of abuse, and that the tracking and grading systems Rebecca had used were designed to keep me destabilized and compliant. Dr. Campbell said the fact that Rebecca had replicated the same pattern with multiple partners suggested a personality disorder that made her fundamentally unable to engage in healthy relationships. She helped me see that nothing I could have done would have satisfied Rebecca, because the system was designed to ensure perpetual failure. The financial fallout was less severe than Rebecca's dissolution analysis had predicted. Most vendors were understanding when I explained the situation, and Attorney Langford helped me recover significant portions of the deposits I'd paid. The venue returned 70% of the deposit given the circumstances. The photographer refunded everything, and the caterer kept only a small booking fee. My total financial loss from the ended engagement was around $8,000, painful but manageable, and nothing compared to what continuing the relationship would have cost me. Rebecca attempted to sue me for breach of promise to marry, but Attorney Langford easily defeated the claim given the documented abuse and the fact that multiple states don't recognize such claims anymore. 6 months after the article published, I ran into Stephanie Cross, the wedding planner, at a coffee shop downtown. She recognized me and asked if she could talk to me for a moment, and we sat at a corner table away from other customers. She told me she'd read Diana's article and had felt validated in her own experience with Rebecca during our brief planning relationship. She said she'd dealt with difficult clients before, but Rebecca's combination of impossible demands and cold manipulation had been unlike anything she'd encountered in 20 years of wedding planning. She said she'd actually documented everything from our interactions in case Rebecca tried to sue her or damage her reputation, which had been her pattern with other vendors who didn't meet her standards. Stephanie told me something else that crystallized the whole situation for me. She said that in her experience, people who approached weddings the way Rebecca did, treating them as performance projects rather than celebrations of love, often had similar issues in their actual marriages if they made it that far. She'd planned hundreds of weddings and could usually tell which couples would last based on how they handled the planning stress. The couples who stayed focused on each other and their commitment tended to have strong marriages, while couples who got obsessed with perfection and performance tended to struggle when real life didn't match their curated vision. She said I'd likely saved myself from years of being held to impossible standards in a marriage that was more about optics than actual partnership. I started dating again after about 8 months, approaching new relationships with hard-earned wisdom about red flags and healthy boundaries. I was more cautious, but also more confident in my ability to recognize manipulation and stand up for myself. I'd learned that real love doesn't come with spreadsheets and performance metrics, that healthy relationships are built on acceptance rather than constant improvement plans. When I met someone new, a teacher named Jenna who'd never heard of Rebecca and had no social media presence beyond a private Facebook account, her genuine warmth and lack of agenda felt almost foreign after years with Rebecca's calculated performance. On our 3rd date, Jenna asked me about my previous relationship, and I gave her the abbreviated version about being engaged to someone who turned out to be controlling and manipulative. She nodded and said she'd been in something similar years ago with someone who made her feel like she could never do anything right, and that leaving had been the hardest and best decision she'd ever made. We talked about relationships and expectations and what we were both looking for, and the conversation felt easy and honest in a way I'd forgotten was possible. When we finished dinner, Jenna insisted on splitting the check, and when I joked that I didn't need a receipt for the expense tracking, she laughed and said her tracking system was just mentally noting that the restaurant had good pasta. A year after the article published, I heard through mutual connections that Rebecca had moved to a different city and was working in a non-client-facing role for a small startup. She'd never publicly acknowledged the truth of Diana's reporting, but the damage to her reputation had been permanent. Her social media presence never recovered, and the personal brand she'd built so carefully had been completely destroyed by the exposure of what she'd done to multiple partners. Some people might have felt sorry for her, but I'd learned from Dr. Campbell that people with Rebecca's patterns rarely changed without intensive therapy they were unlikely to seek, and that her moving on to a new city probably meant she was looking for new victims who didn't know her history. The trauma of that relationship will probably always be with me in some form, a wariness about people who seem too polished, too controlled, too focused on documentation and performance. But I'm also grateful for what I learned about myself, about my capacity to eventually recognize manipulation, even when it's wrapped in the language of modern relationship practices, and about my ability to leave a situation that was harming me, even when leaving felt impossible. Rebecca had taught me what love wasn't, the absence of spreadsheets and grading systems, and in doing so, she'd prepared me to recognize and appreciate what love actually was when I finally found it with someone else. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.